It's different. Yeah. I think we'll have bad weather, but
Sure.
okay. Yeah.
Ok, je pense qu'on peut
Ah, yeah.
commencer.
Teacher.
Donc, bienvenue déjà. Merci d'être venu ce vendredi avant le début des vacances, avant le début d'un long week-end. J'ai le plaisir de vous présenter aujourd'hui István Aranyosi, qui est professeur à l'Université à Ankara. István a fait son doctorat à l'Université de l'Europe centrale. Il a fait un post-doctorat en Australie. Where were you in Australie?
ANU, Canberra.
Okay. L'Université nationale de l'Australie. Oui, depuis il travaille à Belgique. Il est l'auteur de beaucoup d'articles et aussi d'un livre édité par Oxford University Press. When did the book come out? 2013, intitulé The Peripheral Mind, sur le thème de la cognition incarnée. Donc le thème de l'intervention aujourd'hui est la perception et la mémoire. Bienvenue, István.
Merci. Thanks a lot. So, well,
You have a picture.
first of all, sorry.
You have a picture.
Yeah, I think technology is very important nowadays. So first of all, thanks a lot thanks a lot to Kirk for inviting me to do a talk here about this topic, which is not, it's not my research agenda, but it is something that has been at the back of my mind since at least 2 years, I guess. Last time I met Kirk was in Bochum in Germany, where I think we had a little discussion about this. And I think this is the best place, or one of the best places for me to present this thing, given Kirk and other people who are interested in memory and who actually know stuff about memory. So I'm a dilettante about memory, but I write typically whatever occurs to me, and I think I have I have some idea about it. I might write about it. So I hope it won't be something disappointing even for people who are very familiar with the memory literature. I think my paper has been sent around. Maybe some of you have read it. It's quite long. It's going to be even longer than this because I already have feedback that I have to incorporate. I gave this talk 2 or 3 times before in the last 2 months. And so here is the idea of the paper is basically, there are, I think, 3 things going on. One is I wanted to make it clear what a direct realist view of episodic memory should look like. What does it mean to be direct realist? And the main idea here was to consider the literature on perception, where direct realism is, has become a well-established view. In the beginning it was not, a popular view, but I think nowadays it is, at least in England, United Kingdom, is becoming, it's already a quite popular view in perception. So one idea was to see how we can transfer this direct realism from the perception literature into the memory literature, right? And why I thought about this was because there are not many people, I could not identify many people who do it correctly, in my opinion, right? Actually, in the paper I mentioned one person, I think she's German, Dorothea Debus, okay? So she has a really impressive paper, which I read, and I was a bit frustrated because a lot of what I had in mind, she already wrote them. But at the same time, the way in which this paper differs, so I agree with her in her characterization of what a direct realist theory of memory or account of episodic memory should look like. But what this paper brings more than that is to also argue that this is a reasonable view to have, and maybe it is preferable to other, more mainstream views in the philosophy of memory. Okay, so one thing that I do is basically to criticize a few people who put forward under the heading direct realism versions of some theses about episodic memory, and to argue that they don't go far enough, or they don't. What they do is not really direct realism. The second thing I do is I try to explain what I mean by being direct realist about memory, right? And that takes up most of the paper. And then I also argue why this view is a good view to have, or it's a reasonable view to have, and it's not as crazy as it sounds. Okay. So if you have the handout in front of you, I will neglect today because I actually don't know for how long am I supposed to. What's the rule?
How long do you want this?
I think 45 should be okay.
45 minutes.
Okay.
Maximum.
Okay. Yeah, so to save time, because I could talk for 2 hours or something about the critical part when I criticize those people, I will keep that to a minimum, maybe just 5 minutes. I will focus on explicating this view that memory, and from now on I will use the word memory to mean episodic memory, right? Make things simpler. To argue that memory should be considered as a kind of perception of the past. I'll come back to this to explain what exactly I mean by this. So just to dedicate 5 minutes to that part in which I criticize other people. So I take Mike Martin. Mike Martin is famous for being, I think, the main defender of direct realism. He calls it naive realism about perception, right? And he has a paper about episodic memory, and although he doesn't explicitly call it direct realism, he does think. I think the subtext is that he does think that this is the farthest you can get if you are a direct realist about perception into applying that to memory. Right, episodic memory. So what he does for him, basically, episodic memory is retained acquaintance. He does mention Bertrand Russell, who at some point had this view about memory, and the way I read Martin is like, for him, this is the best you can get, or the closest you can get to being a direct realist. The basic idea is that you are direct realist about perception, so you perceived something, a scene, an event, and that was direct. You were acquainted with reality directly, not via some veil of perception or anything like that. And episodic memory is basically the fact that you retain that acquaintance. That acquaintance is preserved over time. Okay. Now, what I found, not good enough, not radical enough, okay, in this proposal, was this idea that, if it's retained, if something is retained or preserved, right, he calls it retention, then it means that when you remember now something, it means that you are at most acquainted with an experience that you have, but you are not acquainted directly with the past, right? And I think that's not radical enough, and I think you can go more radical than that. Okay. Sven Bernecker, he has 2 books about, calls it the metaphysics of memory. I criticize Bernecker. I think he's confused in many ways, and definitely maybe even less radical. He explicitly calls his view, part of his view, direct realism, and he says, okay, my view is direct realist about the content of memory, right? Now, this seemed to me almost like, it's good that I think he's not in the audience, right? But I think this is almost like a trivial claim, because he says, well, the content of memory, what memory is about, the intentional content is the past, and that's direct. But, no one said otherwise. I mean, I'm not aware that anyone said, because the alternative, according to him, is for memory to be an attitude towards a representation, that is tokened now. But of course, that's contrary to the very phenomenology of remembering. When I remember something now, it's not like I'm having an attitude towards a mental representation that I'm tokening right now in my brain. That would be some other mental states. That would be a kind of maybe second order, a second order mental state. I can do it if I want. So right now I remember we had lunch today. It's easy to remember. It's close enough in time. And I remember what I ate, right? But maybe I can also now, even though I'm skeptical, but maybe I can focus on my representation of what I'm remembering. But typically, I think people agree that there's nothing fancy going on with respect to the content of your memory. The content is about the past. There's nothing in the content which is about the present. So it seemed to me that besides other things that Bernecker is confused about, which are basically misapplying the perceptual literature or the map of views from perception to memory, he has all sorts of confusions about what exactly makes a theory of perception directly realistic. Besides that, it just doesn't seem to me, it's not a radical view. It's almost like a view that no one should disagree with. Therefore, it doesn't deserve the name direct realism. Finally, the third one, there's a couple more articles that I haven't had time yet to write about. One is, I think, Kirk with, I forgot the name, I think it's one of your students or former students who wrote the paper. That one is also about more about the content. Where you have a mixed view of kind of. Okay, sorry about that. Yeah. So I do have a couple more things that I might mention in the paper or maybe in footnotes and so on. But the paper that kind of got me when I said, yeah, this is it. This is direct realism. This was Dorothea Davis's paper. And she very nicely explains what exactly direct realism would mean about memory. And it would mean really to apply the same thing as what direct realists in perception do to memory. And that means having an unmediated direct relation to some events in the past. Just like in the perception case, when I see something, so this is veridical perception, right? I have a direct unmediated relation to an object in the environment, right? Now, of course, people who are not familiar with the literature on perception, they might think, well, isn't this like obvious, right? And that's what direct realists say. This is really what the phenomenology. So if you ask ordinary people on the street, when you see a cup, do you really see the cup, or is there something between you and the cup? I mean, most people on the street would say, are you crazy? I see the cup, right? And that's one of their arguments, is like the argument from common sense phenomenology, right? Things get less obvious when you consider famous arguments in the philosophy of perception, arguments from hallucination, argument from illusion, where basically you could have, right now I could hallucinate this cup, right? But I cannot, as far as phenomenology goes, I can't distinguish the veridical perception from hallucination. Therefore, there must be something that these two mental states have in common, and therefore perception is not direct, but it is mediated by this common factor. Okay. Now, to be direct realist in perception is to deny this common factor. So typically it would go hand in hand with disjunctivism, and it would say hallucinatory states and perceptual states are radically different in their nature. They don't deny that there is stuff in common. So here are some things in common. There is an epistemic perspective which is in common. The way things appear to you are the same in the two states. But they downplay that, and they say, well, don't reify the epistemic perspective. A second is a neurological fact. Similar things happen in your brain when you hallucinate them. Of course, I'm simplifying because this is an empirical question. How similar, when exactly? As a matter of fact, there is no pure so-called philosophical hallucination, pure philosophical hallucination is the kind which you cannot distinguish from perception. As a matter of fact, if you read the psychiatry literature, people realize that they are hallucinating, because usually it's also crazy. It's not this, or simple, ordinary, everyday kind of thing. There is something that tells them, oh, this must be a hallucination. Okay. But the idea is that don't take those seriously, in the sense that don't reify over them. Still, the nature of the two states, veridical perception and hallucination, are radically different. So when I say something like the cup seems to me elliptical, the surface of the cup or something, this seems claim is to be decomposed into a disjunction, right? Either I'm perceiving the cup or I'm hallucinating the cup, right? And there is nothing like a common ground which forces us, which we reify, and which forces us to think that perception is really about these intermediaries, right? Okay, so that's about perception. So how do we apply this to memory? So if you look at number 1 on the handout, the slogan version of the view is episodic memory is perception of the past. Now, I already have to make a distinction here, which is not in the paper, but will be. In the paper, I use this term preteriception, come from preterit, the Latin for past. And I would say now that I would formulate it or call it really preteriception or past perception, okay, instead of saying perception of the past. And this sounds very French, by the way. French philosophers like to create words that are. But in this case, I think it's very, very, very justified because of the following. Because if past perception means perception of the past, I have two components, perception and past. So in a way, it would mean just like I have perception of things, in now, just take the same thing, perception, and take the past and replace the now with the past, and you get perception. And that's not the case with one exception that I can think about, is when you watch a star, when you see a star in the sky at night, and the star doesn't exist anymore, right? But you see something, right? That's the famous argument that Russell and other people consider. What's the argument called? The delay argument? Time lag argument. Okay, it's the time lag argument, right? So except for that case, where you could say that, oh yeah, under one interpretation you would say, I literally see the past when I see a star that doesn't exist now. That would be the literal interpretation, perception of the past, right? And that would not be remembering, right? So it would be crazy to say that when I look at the sky and see the star, I say, I'm right now remembering the star, okay? So the first distinction is to distinguish between simply applying perception to past, just like you apply perception to now, and just think of this as a sui generis perception-like, which means that it's analogous to perception, whose object is the past. Okay. So that's the first distinction. So instead of, let's say, episodic memory is perception of the past, I should say episodic memory is a kind of past perception. Past perception, okay, something like that. Or even nicer, preteriception, okay, the Latinized kind of, Latin-inspired neologism that I would use. Okay, so now I get to number 2. So one important idea which I think all authors agree about is that we are talking about personal time here. We are not talking about objective time, since episodic memory is about personal experience, at first sight at least. We are talking about personal time rather than objective time. And I have a little story in the paper. I will just make it shorter now. It's a story to illustrate all the components, or most of the components of the view. So the story is that there are these two researchers, physicists at CERN, and one of their secret projects, they are doing their normal job at CERN, but their secret project is to build a time machine And they are at the stage that when they can test the machine. So one of them says, okay, well, where should we go? In the past, in the future? And he says, oh, I have a genius idea. It's a very nice idea. Well, let's go to next week, next Sunday. There's the lottery draw. I will learn the numbers, lottery numbers, and I'll come back. And then we play the numbers, and we become millionaires. Okay, it's a very, very clever idea. So they test, the time machine, and the guy travels in the future. That travels to next Sunday. He records the draw with his phone. There's a video. Says, cool. Goes back to the present, today. And for some reason, there was some problem with the phone, and the video got deleted. It's not there anymore. So they get frustrated. They're like, man, where is the video? We lose all that money we could have. So the other one tells him, like, try to remember, because you were filming, you were seeing, And he says, man, I can't remember the numbers, I can't remember. I said, I remember everything else, because he was watching this in a pub on the TV screen. I remember things like the pattern of the carpet, which looked a certain way, with certain colors and so on, but I don't remember the numbers. So they give up. And then for fun, next week, they are really sad and frustrated, and then they go to the pub and say, let's watch this lottery draw, this great fiasco. And they're having a beer, and then as they are watching, the guy who was in the future, he starts remembering. Okay. The other guy tells him, like, oh, if you told me now that all of a sudden you remember the numbers, I would kill you. And he's like, oh, it doesn't tell anything, But he slowly remembers first number, second number. There are like, I think, 5 numbers or something. And remembers all of them, but doesn't remember anymore he sees the carpet and so on, but doesn't recognize this. Like, I don't remember this, right? And he doesn't remember the last number. But then he remembers that, he got a panic attack just before the last number was drawn. And he knows that he suffers from a condition which I don't know its name, and I don't know where it is in the paper. But there is a real condition where you have a phobia of number 13. You have an extreme fear and extreme, attitude towards 13. If you see 13, it's like, oh my God, some really bad thing will happen. It's an omen, right? It's a superstition, extreme superstition. So he remembers that he got a panic attack in the pub while watching the draw. He says, it must have been number 13. Right. Okay, so this is the story, and then there are several things here why this story, how this story kind of reflects, explains, or has the examples, the elements of the view. So one is personal time. Personal time, David Lewis introduced this in philosophy. It's a very simple idea. You get time travel if there is a difference between objective time, or external time he calls it, and personal time. External time is going to be measured by external devices, such as, on the internet you can check the time zone, world time, whatever it's called. You can hear on the radio, on TV, what's the exact time, and so on. So it's the time that we measure. And roughly speaking, personal time is the time on your wristwatch. When you time travel, that means for Lewis, he defines time travel as a difference in length between how much time passes in external time versus how much time passes in personal time. Right? So these guys went to the future. This guy went to the future, which is 1 week long. The travel was 1 week long. That's external time. But it took him, let's say, 5 minutes to get there, 5 minutes to get back. Right? So in his personal time, 10 minutes passed. In objective time, he traveled 10 years in the future and 10 years back to the present. Okay, so that's the difference. Now, why it makes sense? Well, it makes sense for the other guy to ask him, like, what were the numbers? He doesn't ask what. He could equally ask what will be the numbers, right? But it also makes sense to say what were the numbers. So because for him this is past, the future from his perspective is a past once he's back in the present. Now, people agree about this. There are some problems with this, the idea of personal time, because personal time implies, involves the concept of a person, in the literature on personal identity, people are aware that personal identity of a person over time is very much, very tightly connected to memory, episodic memory, and that if episodic memory involves personal time and person, and that we get some kind of circularity here, right? I'm not saying this is like unavoidable. People in metaphysics tried, Parfit famously to introduce other kinds of quasi-memory and things like that. But I don't take it as a bad thing. I take it that these concepts are interconnected, and maybe it's a nice thing that we know that we shouldn't worry if we can't really get an independent definition of one without involving the others. Okay, this will be a bit later. We'll see why personal time is important when I discuss some of Kirk's works, or a couple of Kirk's, his book and one of his papers, I think. Okay, so now what about experience? So this is the second point under 2. Is experience fundamental? So is like as I said before, is it simply when I say that I'm direct, I want to be a direct realist about memory, is it simply that I apply perception to something that's the past? As I said before, it's not like that, but I think of it as really a fundamental, primitive kind of faculty that we have. And I checked, from what I checked in the literature, I think Thomas Reid is the only philosopher who had this view, right? And he has a very nice, quite a few pages about memory, episodic memory. And he is a direct realist. And his point is basically that this is just like we have some other faculties. I have the faculty of seeing and hearing and smelling, right? Now, I also have a faculty of remembering. And this is something that puts me into a relation with past events in a direct fashion, right? Experience is important. Maybe it is even necessary, I guess, but that shouldn't mean that it is fundamental. The fundamental thing is really the relation that I have now with something that happened in the past. Right? The third point on the handout. So, how can we explain this slogan, right? So one thing that we should do is to push this analogy with perception, right? Now the analogy is space versus time. Perception is, if you are a direct realist, perception is a relation that you have with objects across space, right? And perception, pretereception, okay, direct realism about remembering would be a relation that you have to objects, events, etc. across time. Okay. So this is the basic picture. Okay. I perceive different things at different distances in space. I pretereceive, okay, different events at different temporal distances in the past, right? There are all sorts of empirical questions that you can raise, and we can study these things, how how well you remember things depending on how far they are in time, and how well you remember them given some importance that they had for you and so on. These are separate questions. At this point, I'm only interested in the conceptual question of whether we can make sense of this remembering as having a direct relation to the past. Okay, so number 4, this is something that Sven Bernacker makes a big fuss about. It's the cotemporality objection. And this is I think the objection in itself is something that ordinary people would raise. Because, last time, this is a good story, because last time I had a meeting maybe 2 months ago with our future dean, who is, although he's a philosopher, but doing aesthetics, and he's also into literature. He's a literature scholar, but also has philosophy papers in very good journals, aesthetics papers. So he's kind of on the edge, not ordinary person, but has specialized philosophical knowledge. And he asked me, like, what are you working on? I said, I'm working on this direct realist view of remembering. I said, oh, what is that? He said, well, basically that remembering is perceiving the past. And then he didn't say anything, and then I said, I know it might sound crazy. He says, yeah, it sounds crazy. Why? Because the past doesn't exist, right? So the contemporality objection is to say that, okay, it cannot be perceptual, in any way. Remembering cannot be perceptual in any way, because the past doesn't exist anymore. It's not here, right? Now I come back to perception, and I say that, okay, you have to, this objection is based on misunderstanding the claim here. The claim is that it is a kind of fundamental sui generis relation that I have to some things or events across time. If this objection were right, then you could raise, by analogy, the same objection to direct realists about perception, right? Because you could say, oh, I'm perceiving those nice mountains that you can see from campus here. They are really nice. I took some photos of them. How can you be direct realist about, because the mountain is so far? The mountain is not here. How can the mountain be part? Because if you are direct realist about perception, the mountain is literally a part of your mental state. It's like an object in a Russellian thought. It's literally a proper part of your mind. Okay. Some other way of putting it is your mind is out there. Okay. It's a very strongly externalist view. So, but that would be crazy. No one says, or no one thought that this is a real objection to that, right? To the direct realism perception. No one says, man, the mountain is just too far. Direct perception is good for this case, okay, because this is close, but not for the mountain. That doesn't make sense. So, I think similarly, by analogy, this is not a real objection. Now, of course, there's a separate issue whether it's an objection for Bernacker. I don't think he should have even discussed it because he's not a direct realist to begin with, according to my standards of what a direct realist should be. But anyway, that's the answer to it. Number 5 is what I call the phenomenology objection, right? So here the idea is that the phenomenology of remembering is just not perceptual, right? It's not like perception. And the answer is to say that, okay, when we say analogy, we don't say that everything is the same as in the other case, right? Analogy means something like similarity in a relevant and important respect, okay? So of course the phenomenology of remembering will be very different from the phenomenology of seeing. You have this presence in seeing, which you have something like the opposite of it in remembering. Part of what makes a mental state remembering phenomenologically is, okay, familiarity, it happened to me, but also the feeling of pastness. It is not now, it's not happening now, right? There were some interesting, I'm very bad with remembering names, but I'm sure Kirk knows there were some experiments where people were induced false memories by transcranial, I think, magnetic stimulation, and they had, students were looking at them in the room, but they were reporting like, oh, I remember these false memories, where they remembered themselves as, seeing actually themselves, something happening. There's some famous...
we are psychologists here, so I guess...
Yeah, so anyway, the idea is that, of course, the phenomenology is different. You should be surprised. I never claim that, yeah, it's exactly like perception in all respects. Okay. Okay, part of the objection is to say, okay, the remembering is not clear and distinct, perception is clear and distinct, and so on. This is also not true it's not true from either side. Even from the perception side, it's not true that perception is clear and distinct, always. I mean, some of you wear glasses, right? And it's clear if you wear glasses. It's not clear if you don't wear glasses. But you don't count as not seeing, right? I guess there's a threshold beyond which it counts as not seeing. If you take off your glasses, no one will say, oh, you are blind, and you don't see, right? You still see. We see through fog. We count as seeing in all sorts of conditions, and, although for philosophy maybe this is like, okay, when you see something clearly and distinctly, that should be the paradigm case. But for ordinary everyday life, you see a lot of things without seeing them well, but you count as just seeing them. So similarly for remembering, of course, you can remember better or worse. That would not change the fact that you are still remembering, right? Okay. Okay, so further down under 5, memory traces. Okay, so people in the causal theory of memory, which is very mainstream theory, I guess, or it was mainstream until people like Kirk came on stage and wanted.
It's still mainstream.
Okay, still. What can we do? Old habits die. Okay. So, I mean, memory traces, most people, of course, accept that there are memory traces, and they are basically something that's preserved, okay, from an experience, such that they will help later, it will help you remember certain things. Memory is generative, most everyone agrees. It's not purely preservative, but it has a part, which is the memory traces, which will trigger certain other parts of the brain, so you will be able to construct a narrative. And remembering is also, so things can happen such as you remember more than you experienced. This sounds paradoxical, but there's nothing paradoxical about it. It's really, you remember something slightly different than what you experienced. Right? There are interesting studies whether the better you experience, the better you remember, and your intuition might tell you that yes, but it's actually the opposite. A colleague of mine from psychology, Bill Kent, she's working on this, and she's called Miri Beskan, and she has 2 or 3 papers proving that the opposite is true, which is very counterintuitive. The better you experience something, the worse you will remember. Okay, I have to get into those papers to see what the explanation is. But the thing is that what could a direct realist say about this? Okay, we don't deny, okay, or, he or she shouldn't deny the existence of memory traces. This is an empirical question anyway, right? And shouldn't deny that memory is not preservation, not pure preservation. That is it's a combination of preservation with generation or regeneration of content. What makes it still direct realist, if you don't deny these things, is the fact that these are ways of remembering, not what it means to remember. Right? You see the difference. There is something what it means to remember, what defines it, and then there are various things which modulate the way you remember it. Right? And it's no different from remembering better or worse. It's no different from remembering for one species than another species. It's no different from how an alien would remember versus how we would remember if we met aliens, visited us, and so on. So in the end, the fact that content is generated and it's constructed and then reconstructed, and there's consolidation period and things like that. So all these empirical facts that we found about memory, they're all super nice, but they won't be like, none of them will be a proof that direct realism is false. Because they are all, a direct realist could say that they are all about the way remembering is modulated. Right? I introduced another another neologism of my own, which again is very nice, I think. I'm not against these things, but like the Derrida with difference. I introduced something nicer than difference, which is called meminization. Okay. Meminization is basically whatever happens when you remember at various levels that you can consider. One is a neurological level, the brain. One is a psychological level, is the level of behavior, verbal behavior, things like that. What you can report when you remember, and one is the phenomenological level, right? So, and these are empirical facts. We don't know everything about them. People study them like real psychologists, not like, I'm a philosopher, I'm lazy, I don't go in the lab. But whatever psychologists discover about remembering, what exactly happens in your brain, what happens in what you report verbally, and what happens in the way it seems or feels to you, like your qualia, whatever, I call all these things memorization, and it's basically a bunch of processes, right? Now, memorization is something for us. It might be something different for dogs, if dogs can remember episodically. It might be something different for aliens. Okay. We study humans, because humans are available and it's the easiest subject for us to study. So let's call it memorization. Okay, so one thing about this, as I understand Kirk and constructivist theorists and so-called post-causal theorists, I think one thing that they say is that we should take memorization seriously, and I think Kirk has a very strongly naturalistic agenda, where he says at some point in the book, he says, okay, I will say something here which might actually contradict common sense, but it conforms to some empirical research, and then in the end we can even, we can even reform, revise common sense, right? So in a way, I think what you say is basically, I don't really care about the concept of remembering as such. I'm not doing like armchair philosophy, but if you force me into this, I will say, well, look, there's a lot of empirical findings which, if you really insist, to talk about the concept, then we should revise the ordinary concept. If the ordinary concept is going to be in conflict with these empirical things. So I think memorization is for someone like Kirk, you call your view simulationism, right? I think the view is basically that the essence of remembering is this process of simulation of the past. Okay, there are several elements that go into this, but essentially the idea is that the process is the thing. The process is this complex process at different levels is really what defines the thing. Okay, I'll move to 6. I will jump over this remembering thing for now because I don't really have time. But okay, imagination and remembering, and this is the last bit of it. So you have on the one hand the simulationist view, right? And I think the view is basically memorization, whatever is going on at these 3 levels, which is an empirical matter, plus a match between what you construct as a story, and this is basically the same process as what's going on in imagination. So Kirk calls it episodic imagination, right? And it's nice that similar things happen in the brain with imagination and remembering. That's a super nice finding, right? Now, simulationists would like to derive some quasi-metaphysical conclusion from this and say that basically memory, or episodic memory, is not essentially different, that is, not different in nature from imagination. Okay. What you further need in order to establish whether something is really an episode of remembering or not is going to be condition of matching. So what you entertain, as I call it, what you memonize, okay, matches something that actually happened. Okay. Now, one problem that I find with this is that this matching thing is like it's magical. It's not. The causal theory was nice because there's a causal chain somehow. It might not be direct, but in some way or other. You can explain, because whenever you have causation, you have causal explanation as well, right? So if you ask a causal theorist what makes this an episode of remembering P, you will say, well, whatever P stands for is going to be an object or property, an event, property exemplification, or something like that. There's a causal chain that I can trace back. And it must be the right kind of causal chain, must not be a wayward causal chain, whatever. There are different further conditions. But it's not magical, right? It's not Deus ex machina. It's like we have the nice causal chain, and that's the basis for why it counts as grammar. So one thing I don't like about simulationism is that it does seem to me that this connection is magical. Now, there's this quote from the paper. I had to put this quote because when I give this talk, I can't remember the argument. I know people like to just use that. But I will read this quotation because we are almost done with it. So I have an argument which I'm really curious about your view about this, a kind of old school armchair kind of philosophy type argument. I think something like simulationism and maybe constructivism in general leads to necessary unforgettability. So here's the quote. So suppose then, for reductio, that the subject in Kirk's story, so by the way, what is Kirk's story? I should say. I think the story was something like, so this is the story about someone who as a child got lost in a shopping mall, right? But this person was too small for that, for what happened, for what this boy, I don't even know how to put it. Because you want to say it was not a real experience.
I can't remember the story.
So I think the idea was that basically there are two ways of thinking about this notion of experience. Because the reason why he mentions this story is he wants to be super radical at some point in the book. And wants to argue that even experience is not necessary for remembering. Okay, which is crazy. Sounds crazy, right? Because you would say if there is something that's necessary, it must be that you must have experienced it. Right? So one thing, his strategy is to distinguish two ways in which we can understand this term experience. And from what I understand, it was experience in a stronger, more loaded sense would be something that has an effect on your senses in any way, and you can also kind of conceptualize it as what happened. And when you are too small, that part of conceptualization doesn't hold. So something happens to you, but you are not in a position to kind of understand what exactly happened. So things like getting lost in the mall and being sought by the parents who got desperate, where is the kid, and so on, things that happen. It happened to you, but you are so small that you are not, I think, conceptualizing it that way. Now later, much later, 40 years later, okay, you meminize this. You meminize, which is whatever you do, let's call it episodically imagined, okay, that you are lost in the mall, right? But, and as a matter of fact, this happened to you. As a matter of fact, this happened to you. So there is match, is the right thing, is the memorization, is the right thing that you do when you remember, and there is match. Now, what happened to you doesn't count as experience because you were too small. Okay. We can already kind of debate about this, but I don't want to accept this for the sake of argument. And then he says, okay, this is one, this should be considered as remembering, and two, it does not involve experience. So here's the quote. Suppose then, for reductio, that the subject in Michaelian's story remembers the episode of having been lost in the shopping mall. Suppose further that the next day he forgets it. What could forgetting the episode possibly mean for Michaelian in this case? Given that the facts of the past are the same, namely that he was indeed lost in a shopping mall, it could only mean that next day the subject cannot memorize the episode, or to be more precise, something that resembles the episode. But not being able to memorize a certain episode, he is, according to simulationism, failing to remember E. since remembering E doesn't require having experienced E, but only that E happened, plus, of course, the memorization of E, failing to remember E occurs regardless of whether E was experienced or not. But then forgetting E occurs whether E was experienced or not, on the condition that E happened. This contradicts the assumption that the next day E was forgotten. What follows is that E is unforgettable. More generally, the consequence is that any past event is unforgettable, or even worse, any past event is unforgettable regardless of whether anyone has ever experienced it. Right? So I think if it's so radical that it leads to even worse things, to think that experience is not needed, combined with the view that it's really the matching which, in such cases, decides the matter, right? Whether it's remembering or not. And so this is one argument. We can talk about it or not. And so the second issue that Kirk raises is that people make a big fuss about the asymmetry. People make a big fuss about the difference between future and past, and they say, well, man, remembering is about the past. Imagination can be about the future, right? So they must be different, different in nature, right? So I think Kirk correctly, he points out some empirical facts about it. Okay, similar things happen, at a neural level when these two processes happen. He says a lot of things that I think they are very correct and reasonable. But in the end, it is, I think we get, although I don't want to get into metaphysics with this paper too much, but in the end, it's a simple idea that, it's very standard and orthodox in metaphysics that there is an asymmetry between future and past. So, and now you might ask, what about my time travel in the future? I just assumed, for the sake of argument, I don't really believe that, because I think the future is open, right? So which future are you traveling to? If you already travel in the future and come back, it means that that future is closed. But I think the future is open. So, but for the sake of argument, okay, let's to use it for this second, let's suppose that time traveling in the future is possible. But the idea is basically that there is an asymmetry, right? So it's not by chance that we remember the past and not the future. And although, let's say, psychologically, neurally, maybe even phenomenologically, things are similar with imagination and remembering, in the end it will be, if you are inquiring into the nature, because one of Kirk's arguments is like to say, okay, there isn't a real difference. You could be disjunctivist about this, but it's a difference without a real, it's a conceptual difference without a real difference. But I think the difference is given by the way this world is built up. So as a matter of fact, the past is closed, you cannot change it, and the future is open. And this openness, I mean, not merely epistemic openness. Not like I don't know what future, but many people in metaphysics think that it's really, it's a metaphysical fact, not just an epistemic fact. Now, interestingly, Thomas Reid has this very nice part in his discussion of memory, where he says, well, it is a contingent fact about us that we don't perceive the future, right? So in a way, what Reid is saying, in a way, he's replying to someone like Kirk. Part of it being like, if Kirk was right, then basically there should be a symmetry between future and past. So by analogy, if remembering is nothing different in nature than imagination, it's a kind of imagination, then basically when I imagine the future, by analogy with what I do when I remember the past, given the matching condition, which is a truth condition or a factivity condition, I should get factivity about the future. Now, as a matter of fact, the future is open according to my view, therefore you cannot have factivity. But Reid says something different. He says, well, if we were built differently, we could have knowledge of the future. Right? But we are not built like that. So we just have memory, which is knowledge of the past, direct, in the most direct way. He says God could have built the world differently and built us differently. And in that case, the very notion of memory would be very different. And I think it would be very close to simulationism, except it would be maybe even more radical, because it would be a kind of direct realism in which you have direct connection to future events, because the world is built like that. Anyway, the idea is that Reed says that, well, this is a primitive fact. We can't explain why things are like this. But we don't explain things about other, sense modalities. Do you ever explain? We know that seeing is different from hearing, but we don't say like, why? It's like, it's a primitive fact. We have this, ability or faculty of hearing, and we have the faculty of seeing. And some animals have other faculties which we don't have, and so on, or radically different faculties, right? Like the bat has a very different faculty of identifying obstacles in the environment rather than our visual system and so on. But we don't ask the further question like why. We just swallow, we accept, oh, this is how they are built, and this is how we are built, and this is how the world is built, right? So in the end, to conclude, the idea would be, I think the author that is closest, like probably 99% of what I'm saying here, is what Reed says, Thomas Reed. I'm not I don't do history or philosophy, I'm not a Reed scholar, but it seemed to me that Reed gets the closest to what the real direct realist about memory or remembering should be. And so in the end, I think this is a good alternative to the causal theory. If you are searching for alternatives, so Kirk's is one alternative, what they call post-causal theories, right? But I think direct realism could be a good alternative. Interestingly enough, and that's the last point that I want to make, interestingly enough, like people who kind of are sympathetic to direct realism, they also insert a causal condition in some way. So somehow they think they associate causation with direct realism. I think that's wrong, because in the perception literature, that's exactly what distinguishes a causal theory of perception from a direct realist theory of perception. The relation that you have in direct realism is that of containment, or being a proper part of, being a constituent part of, and that's much stronger than causation. Causation is a very weak relation, right? Constitution, right? That is being a constitutive part. That's a much stronger relation. So I think if you want a good alternative to the causal theory, and you want to revolutionize and radicalize the field, okay, you should be a direct realist in the way I try to be a direct realist rather than a simulationist, like Kurt proposed in his book and some articles. So I think that's all. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Okay, so I think that we have about half an hour for questions. I think we go for an hour and a half in total. That's good. And I think we can do questions in any language with some translation if necessary.
I quite like this talk. Thanks. It's very stimulating. That's actually the topic that I'm working on right now. I have quite a few questions, but I've just asked one, which I think is a central one. So it wasn't quite clear to me from your talk and from the paper what the motivation is to adopt a direct realist view of memory. So it seems to me that there are two motivations out there, at least in the perceptual literature. So you can be a direct realist because you have some prior epistemological motivation. So let's say you want to say that there's nothing in between the subject and the world, so you can somehow explain how we can know things, how we can form knowledge of things out there. But there's also a more recent motivation, which is phenomenological, and that's to explain how our mental states acquire the quality or the qualities that they have. So why is it that My visual experience of this chair right now has the quality of being read. That's because the chair itself has the property of being read. So I was wondering if your direct realist take on memory is motivated by these two different considerations, because I didn't see why you want to be a direct realist in this epistemological sense. But I find it quite hard to motivate a direct realist view on the phenomenological side of things. So if you wanted to say that the past events somehow constitute our mental state so as to provide them with the qualities that they have, then you end up with the co-temporality problem, because you need the event to be there in order to furnish the mental state with the qualities that it has. So, so what are the motivations behind your textbook?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So the second option, or the second reason why you might go direct realist in the perception case, that's, I think, a very rich topic that could be, there's a lot of questions going on there. At the end of the paper, I say something about something similar, right? Well, I'm not sure what the motivation. So there are several goals that I have in the paper. So one was simply to make it clear once and for all what it means to be direct realist, and how radical it is, maybe even more radical in the case of memory than in the case of perception. Okay. Now, second part is basically to kind of make sense of it. And then a third part is supposed to be to motivate it and to say that, okay, it's not a bad view. I admit that this is the least developed part, and I haven't thought about it beyond simply saying that, okay, here is a view that has been, here are a bunch of views that have been incorrectly called direct realist. Here's the real one, and it is not bad. So I'm not right now kind of pushing, saying like, okay, really this is the best theory, but at least with some very particular, arguments like co-temporality objection and so on, I say that, okay, if you have the right way of thinking about it, you can defend the view against it. There are real problems. So when it comes to generativity, for example, that's one problem. What exactly is the contribution of the direct relatedness of me or my current mental state, mnemonic mental state, the past event, versus the contribution of anything else in this memorization given generativity, right? Some people could argue and could be skeptical and say something like, well, it's not much that your directness of the connection adds to whatever we think is interesting and important about memory. So there is a danger, maybe, that you end up like, it's similar, I think, to, if you think about Kripke's initial, the picture of the meaning of names, the semantics of proper names. People pointed out at the time, saying like, okay, you are so much concerned with eliminating any kind of Phrygian sense, association, and so on, because you will end up with just like a causal chain that blankly goes somewhere, no one knows where. And I should count as a competent speaker of the name John without having any idea about John. I think there's a similar danger here. My mental state of remembering could get back somewhere in such a way that its contribution is so small compared to the generative contribution that the kind of imaginative processes do, that the question arises then, why should you be, what is the value that direct realism would add to that? So I think it's a real problem, and I have to think about a good answer. Regarding, that part, I also admit, with the phenomenology, right? I think the danger there is that, if I'm pushed and forced to answer like, okay, so what is it about the phenomenology that would, just like in the case of perception, would kind of motivate me to this? And I think the danger is that, whatever I can say about phenomenology, and it is specific to remembering, is going to be not the kind of thing that must be specific for directly remembering, right? Vice versa, whatever I say that is kind of specific to directly remembering, it would be at most about the experience that I had, the initial experience. So someone before, when I gave this talk before, someone raised this question, could you have a mixed view, where basically, with respect to perception versus memory, could you be a direct realist about perception? Could you be a direct realist about memory, but not direct realist about perception? What would happen then? So, well, what would happen then is that what you remember now and what you have a direct relation to would be a mental representation which happened in the past. It would still be past perception in my sense, but it would not be of the world. It would be of an experience of the world, which, by the way, is a representation of the world. Right? So, yeah, I admit that I should motivate it better. So for right now, it's just like, look, the view makes sense. I think it has some bad, it avoids some consequences which I think are bad consequences of constructivist views. And I think it is, I'm still sympathetic to the causal view. That's kind of, I don't see big problems with it. It does seem more easier to swallow than constructivist views, I think, and simulationist. But then, yeah, another kind of, way to push a bit for the view is to say that, okay, why not have a revolution, okay, quotation marks, just like there was a revolution in the perceptual literature, because direct perception was actually an alternative to the causal theory. Although the causal theory is not discussed, typically it's other, other things that are discussed as rivals, but I think the causal theory is equally a rival because of the very different types of relations that you have, causation versus constitution. But you are right, I have to think more about motivating it better than now.
So I just asked that question because if your motivations are mostly epistemological, then I wonder why you need to go that far in the direction of direct realism. Why can't you just have some resilient view of content? Let's say that the content of your memory involves the world, or it has a particular has been constituted as being a constituent of the mental state, but then you have the content as explaining the phenomenology of the mental state. So you would satisfy the epistemological motivations, in the sense that you would explain how the mental state relates to the particular in the world, but still have some elements in the mental state itself, that is the intentional content that explains the phenomenology. So that wouldn't be a direct realist view in the radical sense that you described here, but it would satisfy the epistemological motivations.
Yeah, that's right. So I do think each view has kind of some really some parts that recommend them, and some other parts that don't recommend them. So the big task is for anyone. I suppose Kurt would defend simulationism. I say, yeah, some parts of that view are really, there's a positive side to it. But I think some other parts are not like that. So intentionalism in perception, many people are like crazy about being intentionalist precisely because of, you can, in a way, have your cake and eat it in some way. You can avoid certain very classic arguments, but also be direct enough in the sense that you would have content, but kind of Russellian content, right? That's why somewhere in the paper I said, if you are a real direct realist, you have to deny even Russellian content, right? But you're right. I have to think about, is there a good reason, except for just to say that, okay, here is a coherent thing in logical space, There are some arguments for it. It's not totally crazy, although it's nice that it sounds crazy in the beginning, but then in the end you think it's not that crazy, right? But yeah, I'll have to think about it.
Bon, il y avait Lauren et puis Natalia.
So yeah, thank you. I like the talk as well, but there are several things I didn't get, I guess. One is about the distinction you made between the ways of remembering and the definition of remembering.
Yeah.
And another big thing is, like, I think I didn't get the argument about necessary unforgettability.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting. Could you please?
Yeah. Yeah, so the first question, so that's basically, in theories of perception, you have something like adverbialism. Is basically a way, it's motivated, I mean, the reason why it emerged was to kind of avoid these commitments avoid this commitment to sense data or something, there being something in between the perceiver and the world. So, I see the phone, but I don't just see the phone. If I do this, now I see double. Okay, if I take his glasses, in all these cases I see the phone, but in a certain way. So adverbialism is because they use this wise or li termination. I see the phone blurrily if I take his glasses, and I see the phone doubly if I do this. So in a way, part of this view is, a component of this view is to say that, you do what it is that it is an illusion to think that you must reify something that stands in between you and the object, because it's really about ways in which you kind of perceive the object that are they become no less direct just because, there are these adverbial forms that you use in language. I know some people, don't like the view and so on, but it would be something similar here. It would be that several things happen, empirically speaking, in our brain, the way we remember, and who knows, other creatures might remember differently. I have an example with the alien in the paper, again to criticize Kirk's view, is to say that what if you meet an alien tomorrow and we study the alien's brain, and actually the alien is kind of learned to communicate kind of like with us before coming here, so we don't have to worry about figuring out like in the famous movies. They are smart, they already speak English, they learn. So. And they come and and of course you ask them, so how is it on your planet? And say, wow, in our planet the trees are huge and green and the animals are like that, whatever. So in a way, the alien is of course remembering his or her planet, how things are on the planet. So we wouldn't remember it. But now suppose it turns out that we look into the alien's brain and nothing of what happens in our brain happens in their brain. So I think that shouldn't force us to say, oh, he's not really remembering, right? So the alien has a way of remembering as well as just remembering as such, right? So I think that's the distinction, basically.
That's I don't know why, like, generativism couldn't be fine.
Okay,
That
that's
thing,
right.
I think I don't get.
That doesn't follow, that it couldn't be fine. I say, you could go that way. What I'm saying only that you could go my way as well. So the fact that there is generativity, I take it as a contingent fact about us, and don't give it so much importance as to give the metaphysical nature of the thing itself, right? I'm aware that if someone is like a generativist says, this is the thing that defines memory, right? I'm just saying that I'm not forced to go that way. You can come my way, so it's an option, right?
Because it would be easier for the direct realist to be preservationist than to have preservative
it would be.
view.
I'm aware of it. It would be easier. It would be nice if just but that's why I think Kirk's theory works very well empirically speaking. I mean, you get a lot of data about the process is being very similar with imagination and so on, which is a generative process, I think, by its nature. Okay, so this argument, I'm also not sure whether I understand this argument very well. So let's see. So basically what's in this argument is basically something happened, okay, this is what we call the factivity condition, that it's a fact that this boy was lost in a shopping mall. This fact is constant, okay? We keep this fixed. Okay? And now in the simulationist view, you would have it that given this fact which we keep fixed, this happens, right? What you need is basically the right kind of processes to go on in order for what's happening now to count as remembered, right? Now, what I'm asking is, what about forgetting? And I'm not sure. Do you have a paper on forgetting? Maybe I think
I have an old paper on forgetting,
which is not
but it's not really relevant to this.
Okay, yeah.
And actually, it's a point that I haven't thought about very much. We got an abstract for the conference that we're organizing, in which the author promises to talk about forgetting as a potential problem for the simulation.
Oh, okay.
It looks very interesting.
Yeah.
But so far, no one has sort of carefully
Yeah.
thought this through.
Yeah,
Not me.
because I seem to remember an old paper that was forgetting, but I didn't have time to check. Okay, so it's good that it's not that. It's not related to this. So yeah, I think the argument is basically, okay, if that's so basically if we keep the facts as they are, keep them fixed, suppose someone remembers something now, forgets it tomorrow, right? Forgetting happens all the time. It's a very usual, ordinary kind of phenomenon. How does someone like Kirk explain forget, or what does it mean for him to forget, right? Now, since facts are fixed, it must mean that this person is not what I call memorizing it. His brain is not doing the right thing. Okay. That's why he does not remember
It's
it.
not or cannot. Because in the quote here you say
Cannot.
the subject cannot, and that sounds plausible to me. Is not is clearly not right.
Okay, okay. Which one is not right?
Is not.
Is not right.
So if I say, look, you're forgetting when you can no longer, to use my own jargon, you can no longer generate a representation of the past event.
So it's a dispositional thing, right? It's kind of
It's about your capacity, or maybe, I'm not sure exactly how you want to analyze it, but it's not about whether you're actually generating the representation at the present time or not. That would just have weird consequences. I'm not sure whether that's what's going on.
Yeah, mine must be cannot, yeah. Cannot minimize the episode. Okay. But not being able to memorize, okay, not being able to do those processes in the brain, that counts as failing to remember, not to remember.
Sorry, before you go any further, can I, because I had the same question, I don't quite follow the reasoning. I mean, I'm not saying it's wrong, I'm saying I don't follow. So you start by saying, okay, the subject remembers an event, then he forgets it.
Yeah.
Suppose that we're simulationists. What does it mean to say that he forgets it? It means that he can no longer generate, or he can't at present generate a representation of it.
Yeah.
And then you say, not being able to memorize, not being able to generate a representation is failing to remember, given that we're simulationists. And that step of the argument as well, I don't understand. Why shouldn't I say that he's failing to remember?
So what else would you say?
I'm not sure why I want to say that he's doing anything. I guess I just don't understand your use of the expression failing to remember here. So, I mean, if he's trying to remember.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, so if he's trying to remember and he's unable to generate a representation, then he's failing to remember. Okay.
Yeah, but by your argument, this doesn't require having experienced it, right?
What doesn't? Yeah, well, I mean.
So if basically what's required to remember is if to remember it's not required to have experienced it, then to forget also does not require experience, right? So,
So I'm not sure, I mean, I haven't proposed an analysis of forgetting, so I mean, I guess I don't mean to say, so I don't mean to say that you're forgetting something if you can't now generate a representation of it. Presumably, you can only apply that notion of forgetting if you previously could generate a representation of it.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's not going to be a useful notion. So, okay, so where is this?
So I think things would be simpler. I think the key there is really that matching or factivity condition, because things would be easier if Kirk said only, look, remembering, if he didn't have this matching condition at all, he said remembering is just a kind of imagination, full stop. He says it's just generating the right, well, I already said the right, generating some content, right? This would be a truncated view, which is not your view, right? Things would be simpler like this, because here forgetting would just mean, well, today I can do it, I can generate content, tomorrow I can, and this is a full story of the forgetting. Now, because I have the matching condition, right, suppose tomorrow I can't generate the content, what makes this count as forgetting? Well, if the experience was not necessary, as in your story, then basically this should never count as having forgotten anything, right? Because the factivity is basically something that is not up to you. This is external to your anything that's in your power. That's why I said it's kind of, for me, it looks like a magical connection. Factivity looks like.
Before you get to that, so I'm still not following. I mean, the main part of the argument here. So, I mean, suppose that I give you the following definition of forgetting. At a certain time t, you can generate a representation of an event from your personal past. At a later time t plus something, you can no longer generate a representation of that event. Suppose that I give you that definition. How does that get me into trouble? So we have this point about failing to remember. So I'm trying to remember, but I'm forgetting. Is that the idea? And then somehow we're supposed to get to the conclusion that every event is unforgettable.
So the key is basically, if you don't need the experience, as you say, right? So if all you need is that E happened, the event happened. This is something, whether something happened or not, this has nothing to do with you in any way. If experience is not needed. So it's no different from, the Notre Dame burnt down, right? So I think the key is basically about this experience condition here. If what makes it remembering is really whether the event occurred or not, right, then basically forgetting would not make sense, right? Because today I can generate content that happens to match that event, right? Which, by the way, didn't require my experience of it, right? Then basically, as long as the event is still there,
So I'm thinking here of slightly different scenarios. So let's say that you somehow need to say that you need the subject needs to be able to forget something. So that's the reduction part of the argument. So your analysis somehow presupposes that, but you can't really say that because you don't have the experience condition. So I'm thinking.
No, I'm not following. Why can't I say that?
Because if you don't have the experience condition, then you can't say that the subject forgets. Is that the idea?
Yeah.
And so the case that I
Sorry,
was...
why can't, if I don't have an experience condition, why can't I say that the subject forgets?
So that's why I was thinking about a slightly different case. So let's say that I'm trying to remember seeing the fall of the Berlin Wall on the television, and you can't really say that I'm failing to remember that event because I haven't really experienced that event, but the event happened, it was television. So I think the idea isn't that what you have in mind, that I can't really say that I'm failing to remember that event because I haven't experienced it.
Yeah.
And so if you can't say that, then you don't have an essential element in your analysis, which is to say that the subject needs to forget in cases like shopping mall.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, cases. So this is a tricky aspect of the theory. So what I actually say in the book is, I can't remember exactly. But what I say is something like to remember. Leave out certain details that don't matter here. So I mean, yeah, I assume that you can only remember what's part of your personal past. I don't assume that something needs to have been experienced in order for it to count as part of the personal past. I also don't really have a positive story about what makes something part of your personal past or not.
Yeah.
And that's, I don't know if it's a weak point of the theory, it's an underdeveloped aspect of the theory. In fact, I'm not totally sure that I want to even say that. So it might be that I should just say, remembering is essentially past-directed imagination. And yeah, sure, you can remember episodes that you didn't, events that you didn't experience, even when they're not part of your personal past in any meaningful sense. This would be totally counterintuitive, totally
You're getting more and more radical.
But it might be that, to run the same kind of argument that I run in the book, look, you've just got one psychological capacity there. It can be trained on events that belong to your personal past, whatever exactly that means. It can also be trained on other events that you weren't there to experience, things that you've learned about indirectly somehow. So, fine. So what happens if I say that? Does that help me? Does it make it worse?
And it's already worse in itself. But yeah, it's more radical, I think, because now you demand. But anyway, I don't think, because if you say personal past, to me, personal past and experience, they are really tightly connected. Because, and I'm not sure how tightly, that maybe even conceptually connected, right?
Yeah, I could go in that direction as well. I could just deny, because the only way I could say you can remember something even if you didn't experience it, given the framework that I use in the book, is to assume that there can be events that are part of your personal past, but that you didn't experience. It's not clear that that's right. I had a hard time
That's one way.
good examples.
You give an example with your grandfather, and I don't remember what you say exactly about your grandfather leaving the Ottoman Empire.
I can't remember.
I'm also not sure
how
what
I
you say about
the example. No, I remember thinking about the example is so something happens to you while you're asleep. You don't experience it, but it's part of your life because you're asleep. Or somebody drinks too much and he does some stuff and then he doesn't remember what he did. That's not the right way of putting it, but you get the idea. But I had a hard time with convincing examples.
But you are right, this argument is too compressed. I need to make it more. I'm not even sure I will keep it because it's like a paper. Could be a paper in itself. Which is the problem of forgetting for simulations.
We can talk about it afterwards, because we're running out of time and people may have other commitments. So there was one more question, and then I say anyone who wants to continue to discuss can hang around, but that way we'll take the last question and then it's free to leave.
So my question is just with aims of clarification because it touches my topic a little bit. It's not clear to me your definition of personal time because you illustrated it by a clock that I own in opposition to a calendar that measures external time. But a clock is just a fabricated object that I accidentally bought, so for me it's just as external as a calendar. And I also did not grasp what is the relationship between that and the perception of the past in your view. I don't understand.
Yeah. So it's a good question, because I mean, Lewis has a parenthetical thing at the beginning of his paper on paradoxes of time travel. He says it's more like, okay, it's more like, what do you call it? More like an instrumental definition, right? It's like we have nothing better, better way of putting it, because that's what you see in movies. People get into the time machine, and you know they they have a watch on their wrist, right? And then they travel, and then it's like, oh, right? Of course, it's not like this must be like this. It's a way of making the point that time travel. There might already be a problem here about time travel. Who knows, right? But for illustrative purposes, it's just like, okay, how much time passed for you as a subject when you were in the time machine? So in a way, the time machine temporarily isolates you from the rest of the world, right? So that's the thing. Don't take it super metaphysically and literally and seriously. It's just a way of, we try to have a way of making the point. What was the second one?
The relationship with this perception of the past.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, it's partly related to this very last point, because it's really, like Kirk talks a lot about the personal past, right? So a personal past and personal time, I think, are interconnected conceptually. That's the only reason why I mentioned it. So, in other words, some things that would follow, of course, which I don't know, Goethe might disagree, like you cannot remember things that happened before you were born. I don't know, right?
Yes.
Right, things like that, but nothing super deep. It's just a kind of, just to get the discussion started, because later in the paper I get back to personal time, personal past, right, personal past. And personal past must be connected to the way time has passed subjectively for me, right? And then you get also empirical studies on, how people perceive time, like in accidents, time gets compressed, and things like that, right? And we need to. But yeah, there's nothing super. It's just a point to make in the beginning of the paper, so we know what we have to.
Ok, bon, merci encore toutes et d'être venus, et merci notre intervenant. Okay, let's go to